Have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if, in the middle of the night, alone in an empty and dark place, you heard someone call your name? What if I told you that this didn't happen in a horror movie, but in the real life of an ordinary man, working a random night shift in Detroit? It was exactly 2:37 a.m. when Marcus Williams heard it for the first time, a distant metallic sound coming from the back of the abandoned warehouse where he worked as a security guard. He stopped. He held his breath. He pointed his flashlight into the deep darkness of the empty corridors. Nothing. Just the heavy silence that usually fills places forgotten by time. But then, he heard it again. Louder. Closer. And it was at that moment that Marcus realized something that made every muscle in his body freeze. It wasn't an echo. Echoes don't call you by name. Echoes don't whisper words that only you should hear. Marcus was an experienced man, a Navy veteran, someone who had faced extreme situations and emerged unscathed. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He didn't believe in ghosts. He wasn't startled by strange noises. But that night, something was different. Something was profoundly wrong. And the worst part? The more he tried to understand where that voice was coming from, the more voices began to appear. Multiple, overlapping, all whispering the same name, Marcus. Can you imagine the despair? The feeling that something invisible is watching your every move, knowing every detail. About you lurking in the shadows. What Marcus discovered that night would change his life forever, and almost ended it. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind that sound is something you will never imagine. We're not talking about an urban legend or a made-up story meant to scare you. We're talking about a dark secret that Detroit tried to bury for over 40 years. A secret that was patiently waiting to be discovered. And when it was, it all came to light in a devastating way. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about courage, truth, and how far some people are willing to go to hide the unhideable. Marcus moved forward, not because he was brave, but because something inside him told him he needed to, that those voices, however disturbing they were trying to say something. And you know what that makes me think? How many times in our lives do we hear signs, realize that something is wrong, but choose to ignore them because it's easier, safer, more comfortable? Marcus could have run out of that warehouse, quit his job, forgotten everything. But he didn't. And what he discovered by following those voices changed not only his life, but the story of dozens of families who had been waiting for answers for decades. Look, if you're feeling that chill down your spine right now, if this story is affecting you in some way, I need to ask you something. Leave a comment below telling me, do you have the courage to investigate? Or would you have run away from that place? There's no right or wrong answer, okay? I just want to know what you feel, what goes through your head when you hear a story like this. Because it's precisely this exchange, this connection between us, that gives this channel meaning. Your participation here is what makes this work grow and reach more people who also want to hear real, impactful stories that make us reflect on courage, truth, and humanity. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button now and activate the bell. Why? Because every week I bring you stories like this, stories that nobody else is telling, real stories that deserve to be heard. And of course, if the video has held your attention so far, leave a like below. This really helps the algorithm show this content to more people who need to hear it. Every like, every comment, every share makes all the difference. Truly. Now, going back to that night in Detroit, Marcus was about to discover something that would change everything. Before we continue, you need to understand who Marcus Williams was, because we're not talking about just any guy who was easily scared. Marcus was 43 years old, a veteran of the American Navy, someone who served his country in conflict zones, who knew the weight of responsibility and the true meaning of the word discipline. After leaving the military, he found in the job of night watchman a way to use his skills and keep his mind occupied. For 8 years he had been doing this kind of work. 8 years walking alone through empty warehouses, abandoned factories, silent depots in the early morning. And throughout those years, Marcus had seen absolutely everything. intruders trying to steal equipment, rats the size of cats moving among the boxes, even a homeless person who had turned a container into an improvised dwelling. None of that kept him awake at night. None of that made his heart race. His co-workers even had a nickname for him, Iron Marcus, the Iron Man. He was almost a legend among the security guards in the region. While others requested transfers after a week in places considered frightening, Marcus remained firm, impassive, confident. He didn't believe in ghost stories. He wasn't swayed by superstitions. He didn't waste time on irrational fears. For him, everything had a logical explanation. It always had. Marcus's mentality was simple and direct. Fear is just a lack of information. If you understand what's happening, there's no reason to fear. And this transformation that the army had worked on him, this ability to remain calm under pressure, was what made him so good at what he did. His superiors trusted him completely. They knew that if something happened, Marcus would know how to handle the situation. Without panic, without drama, just action and quick decisions. But that October night in 2023 was different. Something had changed. For the first time in decades, Marcus felt that ancient, almost forgotten sensation creeping up his spine. That primal shiver that the body triggers when it recognizes real danger, even if the mind hasn't fully processed what's happening. Even Iron Man felt his blood run cold. And that was no small thing. Think about it. What would it take to shake someone with that level of experience? What kind of situation could make a war veteran, a man trained to face the worst humanity has to offer, feel genuine fear? The answer was hidden in the corridors of that warehouse, and Marcus was about to discover that some hidden truths are so disturbing that not all the training in the world can prepare you for the impact they cause. Because it wasn't just about hearing voices, it wasn't just about strange sounds in the darkness. It was about what those voices represented. It was about the journey he was about to begin without knowing it. A journey that would take him to the darkest backstage of Detroit's history, to revelations that had been buried for over 40 years, patiently waiting for someone brave enough to unearth them. Marcus didn't know it yet, but he had been chosen. Not by fate or mysticism, but simply because he was in the right place, or perhaps the wrong place at the right time. And because, unlike the 5 vigilantes who came before him and resigned, Marcus wasn't going to simply ignore it and move on. And now let me tell you about the place where all this happened, because understanding. The warehouse is understanding why this story is even more chilling than it seems. Porter & Son's warehouse was no ordinary place. It was located in Detroit's industrial zone, an area that had seen better days, where gigantic factories and abandoned warehouses told the story of a prosperous past that simply vanished. 50,000 square meters of rusted metal structures, seemingly endless corridors, soaring ceilings where the light of a flashlight barely reached. It was the kind of place that seems bigger on the inside than on the outside, where every sound echoes strangely, and the feeling of being watched never completely leaves you. But it wasn't just the architecture that made the place unsettling. It was the past. It was the story that nobody liked to tell but that everyone knew. In the 1980s, the warehouse served as the main depot for a pharmaceutical company called Helios Medical Supply. At the time, it was one of the largest distributors of medicines and hospital equipment in the entire American Midwest. Trucks came and went daily. Hundreds of employees worked there. It was a thriving, profitable, and respected business. Until in 1985, everything stopped. Suddenly, without warning. The company closed its doors overnight after what newspapers of the time simply called an incident. No one explained exactly what had happened. The authorities issued vague statements about administrative irregularities. The employees' families received generous compensations accompanied by confidentiality agreements. And the warehouse? It remained there, abandoned, locked, forgotten for almost 40 years. When it was finally reopened to be used again as a storage facility, problems with the security guards began. 5 different people were hired before Marcus, 5 experienced professionals, some with decades of night work behind them, and all 5 resigned within weeks. Some lasted only days. The justifications were always similar, variations on the same theme. Something is wrong with that place. Some reported inexplicable sounds. Others spoke of a constant feeling of unease, as if they were invading a space where they were not welcome. One swore he saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be anything. Another said he smelled strong chemical odors in specific areas, even decades after the pharmaceutical company had left. The security company began to have difficulty finding replacements. Nobody wanted that job. That's when they called Marcus. And when they told him about the previous resignations, the complaints, the strange stories, he simply laughed. To him it was all nonsense. The mentality of people who let themselves be carried away by their imagination, who transformed normal noises from old structures into something supernatural. Marcus didn't believe in bad energies or cursed places. He believed in rational explanations. He believed that irrational fear was simply a lack of courage to investigate the truth. And it was precisely this mentality that made him accept the job without hesitation. In fact, he even liked the challenge to prove that there was nothing special about that place, that the other security guards were simply too weak or superstitious. That was the transformation he wanted to bring about, to change the reputation of that warehouse, to show that it was just another old building in need of maintenance. For the first few weeks, Marcus felt completely justified. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. His rounds proceeded silently. He walked the endless corridors with his flashlight, checked the door locks, noted any irregularities in the report. Just routine work. Boring, even. He even texted his friends saying he'd found the easiest job of his life, that he was being paid to basically walk around and do nothing. The behind the scenes of this story, what was really happening there, had not yet been revealed, but it was about to be, because some hidden truths have their own timing. They wait, they observe, and when they finally decide to manifest themselves, the impact is devastating. Marcus always laughed at the stories about that place, until that October night in 2023, until the moment he heard his name whispered in the darkness. If you've ever entered a place and felt that something wasn't right, comment below, "I felt that too." Because what Marcus was about to experience would completely transform his understanding of what is real and what we can explain. It was exactly 2:37 a.m. when everything changed. Marcus was in the middle of his third night patrol, following the same route he took every morning. Steady steps, flashlight in his left hand, radio strapped to his belt, everything perfectly normal, everything under control. He was passing the entrance to Sector D, the oldest part of the warehouse, that area where only rusty equipment abandoned for decades remained, when he heard it. A metallic sound, distinct, clear, coming from somewhere deep within that dark corridor. Marcus stopped. Immediately, his military training kicked in automatically. He turned his head toward the sound, pointed the flashlight into the dense darkness that swallowed everything beyond the first few meters. The beam of light cut through the dusty air, revealing only rows of empty shelves, stacked boxes covered in dust, distorted shadows on the metal walls. Nothing moved. Absolute silence. Marcus waited. He mentally counted to 10. Controlled breathing. Senses on high alert. Maybe it was just the old structure settling in, he thought. Old buildings make strange noises all the time. Thermal expansion. Wind hitting a poorly closed window. Rational explanations. There were always rational explanations. He was about to continue his patrol when it happened again. Clang. The sound echoed off the walls, louder this time, impossible to ignore. And what was worse, closer, much closer than it should be. It was as if something or someone was moving towards him, advancing through the invisible corridors of Sector D. The difference was now clear. The first sound could have come from anywhere, but this second one, this one was definitely closer, and that meant movement. It meant intention. Marcus wasn't an idiot. He had protocols to follow. Suspicious situations required immediate communication with headquarters. His hand went straight to the radio strapped to his belt. His fingers were already on the button, ready to press and report a possible intrusion into Sector D, when he heard something that made every rational thought in his mind simply freeze. A voice. Weak, distant, but completely unmistakable. And it was saying a single word, a name. His name. Marcus. It was just a whisper, almost imperceptible, as if it were being carried through the air from afar. But he heard it. With absolute clarity he heard it. And at that moment, all his training, all his experience, all that Iron Man mentality he had built up over decades faltered, because there was no rational explanation for it. None. The impact of this revelation was instantaneous. Marcus felt his heart race in a way it hadn't in years. His hands, always steady, trembled for a fraction of a second. The flashlight flickered, creating dancing shadows on the walls. All those stories the previous vigilantes had told, all those surrenders he had ridiculed as weakness or superstition, suddenly didn't seem so absurd anymore, because now it was happening to him, and there was no denying it. There was no rationalizing it. Someone or something inside knew who he was, knew his name, and was calling to him in the darkness. The decisions Marcus made in the next few minutes would determine not only what happened to him that night, but also whether a truth buried for decades would remain hidden or finally come to light. He had two clear options. He could press that button on the radio, call for reinforcements, leave the warehouse, and wait for help to arrive. That would be the safe move. The smart move. It was what any procedure manual would recommend. Or he could do what his military instinct, that voice trained to face the unknown, was screaming at him to do: investigate. Discover the origin of that voice. Understand what was happening. Because if there was one thing Marcus had learned throughout his journey, both in the army and in life, it was that running from fear only makes it grow. The only way to conquer the unknown is to illuminate it, to transform mystery into knowledge. And that's what he decided to do. Marcus put down the radio, adjusted the grip of his flashlight, and took the first step towards Sector D, towards that voice that knew his name. And what Marcus found when he followed that voice was only the beginning of something much bigger and more disturbing than he could ever have imagined. Marcus stepped forward. His first reaction was completely rational, as it always was. Someone was inside. An intruder. Probably someone who had studied the warehouse beforehand, who knew the patrol schedules, who might even have known his name through social media research or conversations with employees. People do that. Professional thieves study their targets, they investigate, they prepare. That was the logical explanation, and Marcus clung to it like a life preserver in the ocean of uncertainty that was beginning to form in his mind. He kept his hand firmly on the flashlight, his heart racing, but his mind still focused, still operational. Military training never completely abandons you. Even when everything inside you is screaming to run, there's that trained voice that says, assess, analyze, act. And that's what he did. Corridor after corridor, Marcus followed the sound. With each step, the beam of light from his flashlight revealed more of the same desolate scene. Rusty shelves, boxes stacked for decades, dust suspended in the air as if it had never been disturbed. But something was changing. Marcus noticed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The temperature. The deeper he went into Sector D, the colder it got. And it wasn't normal cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you expect to feel in an old, poorly insulated warehouse on an October morning. It was a damp, heavy cold that seemed to cling to the skin and penetrate the bones. The kind of cold that makes you want to curl up, protect yourself, go back to where there is warmth and light. Marcus pulled his jacket closer to his body, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop now. Because he needed to understand. He needed this transformation of mystery into knowledge. And then something happened that made his entire theory of the rational intruder crumble like a house of cards. The voice. He realized it wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from several, multiple points at the same time. To his left, a weak whisper, Marcus. To his right, another, a little louder, help. Behind him, making him turn sharply with the flashlight, Marcus, are you alone? They were. Different voices, some higher-pitched, others lower-pitched. Some sounded young, almost childlike. Others seemed heavy with weariness, despair. But they all knew his name. They were all whispering at the same time, creating a terrifying cacophony that echoed off the metal walls of the warehouse. Marcus's mind, always so organized and logical, began working in overdrive trying to process the impossible. How could someone be in so many places at the same time? How could multiple people have broken in without him noticing? And why did they all know his name? The impact of this revelation was only beginning when Marcus lowered his flashlight to the ground and saw something that completely transformed his understanding of the situation. Footprints, wet marks on the dusty concrete. But they weren't adult footprints. They were small, delicate, children's footprints. And it wasn't just one set. There were several going in different directions, crossing each other, forming a chaotic pattern. That seemed to tell a story of running, of playing, or perhaps of escaping. But how could they be wet? It hadn't rained for days. There were no leaks in that area. And even more disturbing, the footprints looked recent. The water still glistened in the flashlight, as if someone had just passed by, as if children had just run through that abandoned corridor where no one should have been for decades. Marcus knelt down, bringing the flashlight closer to the tracks. His veteran mind, trained in basic forensic analysis, struggled to process what he was seeing. The size indicated children perhaps 6 to 10 years old. The distribution of the footprints suggested rapid movement. There were splashes on the sides, like when someone runs barefoot on a wet floor. But where did they come from? Marcus followed the trail with his eyes. The footprints led deeper into Sector D, to an area he had never fully explored. To the back of the warehouse, those sections that don't even appear on official maps. And the voices continued, now more insistent, more urgent. Marcus, please, Marcus, help us. Marcus, don't go away. It was as if they knew he had found the footprints, as if they were guiding him to something, to some specific place. And it was at that moment that Marcus made the decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to call for reinforcements. Not yet. Because if there were children involved, if somehow there were minors in danger in that warehouse, every second counted. That was the mindset that guided him now. No longer fear or confusion, but responsibility, duty. That protective instinct that some men can never switch off, no matter how much danger they face. Marcus stood up, adjusted the handle on the flashlight, and began to follow the wet footprints. Toward the unknown. Toward a truth that had been hidden for too long. If you were following those footprints, what would go through your head? Comment with just one word. Courage or madness. And get ready. Because what Marcus found by following that trail will completely change your perspective on this story. The wet footprints led Marcus through corridors he knew well, or at least thought he knew, until they reached a point that made all his knowledge of that place be questioned. Deep inside Sector D, hidden behind a pile of rotting pallets and boxes marked as industrial waste, was a metal door. A heavy door, the kind you find in bunkers or secure facilities. And Marcus knew, with absolute certainty, that door shouldn't be there. He had the complete warehouse map memorized. He had studied every inch of that floor plan before accepting the job. That door simply didn't exist in the official records. It wasn't in any document. It didn't appear in any evacuation plan. It was as if someone had deliberately erased its existence from all records. And that, more than any voice or wet footprint, should have made Marcus stop and reconsider his decisions. But he didn't stop. Because the door was ajar. Just a few centimeters, but enough to see that on the other side there was an even denser darkness than that of the warehouse. Marcus pushed the cold metal with his free hand, and the creaking of the rusty hinges echoed like a scream in the silence. The flashlight's light immediately revealed what lay beyond. A staircase. Concrete steps descending to some kind of basement that shouldn't exist. The transformation of the environment was instantaneous. The air rising from that hole was different. Cold and damp, yes, but also laden with a smell that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It was something chemical, pungent, mixed with mold and decades of dampness. The kind of smell that clings to your throat and makes you want to cover your nose. The kind of smell that tells stories of things forgotten, buried, purposefully hidden. And the voices. My God, the voices. Now they were much clearer. No more distant, confused whispers. They were direct, desperate pleas from below. "Help us. Marcus, please don't go away, we're here." The emotional impact of those words was devastating, because they sounded genuine. They sounded like children really asking for help. And Marcus, even with all his training, even with all his experience, couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just turn his back and walk away, because if there was the slightest possibility that someone needed help down there, he had a moral obligation to investigate. That's what separated people like Marcus from the rest of the population. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to act despite it. It was the mentality of putting duty above personal comfort. Marcus descended the steps carefully. Each step echoed in the confined space. The staircase was longer than he expected. It descended at least 6 meters below the warehouse level, and when he finally reached the bottom and shone his flashlight ahead, what he saw chilled his blood in a way that neither voices nor footsteps had managed to. It was a laboratory, an abandoned laboratory, but unmistakably functional at some point in the past. Stainless steel surgical tables, now covered in rust and stains that Marcus preferred not to identify. Overturned metal cabinets, their doors open, revealing broken vials and old medical equipment. Test tubes scattered across the concrete floor, some still containing liquids of suspicious colors that had partially evaporated over the decades. And on the walls, protected by metal filing cabinets, hundreds of folders. Marcus approached trembling, not from cold, from something far worse, from a premonition, from a growing certainty that he was about to discover something that would change everything. He picked up one of the folders at random. The cover was moldy, the paper yellowed with age but still legible, and what was written there made everything, absolutely everything, begin to make horrifying sense. They were children's files, full names, dates of birth, black and white photographs of young faces, some smiling innocently at the camera. Detailed medical information, records of procedures, signatures of doctors whose names Marcus recognized from plaques in Detroit hospitals, all dated between 1982 and 1985, all related to something called Project Helios. And the more he read, the clearer the magnitude of what he was discovering became. This wasn't just an abandoned warehouse, it was the backstage of something much bigger, something powerful people had worked hard to keep hidden. The revelations continued with each folder he opened. Children from orphanages, children from poor families, children no one would seek out, all brought to that basement under the pretext of free medical exams, and then subjected to tests, experimental drugs, invasive procedures, all meticulously documented, all signed, all legal on paper, but profoundly, horribly wrong in practice. Marcus sat in one of the old chairs, holding those files with trembling hands, and that's when he understood. The voices. They weren't ghosts. They were memories. They were echoes of something terrible that had happened there. Marcus continued flipping through the documents, and with each page, the truth became clearer and more devastating. Everything was meticulously documented. Between 1982 and 1985, Porter & Sons was not just a pharmaceutical warehouse. It was a front for something far more sinister. The company was deeply involved in medical experiments that today would be considered crimes against humanity. Project Helios, as it was called internally, had a seemingly noble goal on paper: to develop revolutionary treatments for childhood illnesses. But the methods were utterly indefensible. Children from local orphanages, children from extremely poor families who signed documents they could barely read, were brought to that basement under promises of free medical care, and then they were subjected to experimental drug tests without any proper ethical oversight, without real consent, without protection. The files listed 23 children, 23 names that Marcus read aloud in the silence of that abandoned laboratory, as if to honor them, to acknowledge that they existed. Sarah Thompson, 8 years old. Michael Rodriguez, 7 years old. Keisha Washington, 9 years old. The list went on, and next to each name, cold and inhumane clinical notes. Adverse reactions, side effects, some marked with a simple and brutal note, did not return for follow-up. Marcus didn't need to be a doctor to understand what that meant. Many of these children never returned home. They never had the chance to grow up, to have a life, to become who they could have been. And the worst part? There were records of payments, financial agreements with families. Amounts that today would seem ridiculous, a few $1,000s, offered to desperate people in exchange for their silence. In exchange for burying their questions along with their children. The case was hushed. Up with frightening efficiency. Marcus found correspondence between company executives, lawyers, and even some local political figures, all coordinating how to make it disappear, how to transform a tragedy into a secret. The company closed in 1985, not due to public pressure or investigation, but by strategic decision. They changed their name, relocated operations, and left that warehouse as a silent tomb for evidence that should never see the light of day again. It was a calculated transformation. From criminals to victims of economic circumstances. The public narrative at the time spoke of financial difficulties, of corporate restructuring. No one mentioned the children. No one asked the right questions. And over time, the story was simply forgotten. Or at least that's what those responsible hoped. But then Marcus noticed something that made everything take on another level of disturbance. The voices he had heard. Those desperate pleas calling his name. He lifted his eyes from the documents and began to explore the laboratory more closely. And that's when he saw wires. Old wires, the kind used in communication systems decades ago, snaking through the walls like veins of a dead organism. They climbed up the basement walls, disappeared into the ceiling, presumably connecting to the larger structure of the warehouse above. Marcus followed one of the wires to a dark corner where he found dust-covered electronic equipment, reel-to-reel recorders, vacuum tube, amplifiers, an old sound system but still connected to power through deteriorated wiring that somehow still worked. And there were tapes, dozens of magnetic tapes stored in metal boxes. Marcus picked one up with trembling hands. The label was faded, but still legible. Session 47, August 1984. He couldn't play it right there, but he understood immediately. The voices weren't ghosts. They were real recordings. Recordings of the children who had passed through that place. Their voices had been captured decades ago, during the procedures, during their moments of fear and pain and confusion. And through some flaw in the old electrical system, some bizarre connection maintained over the years, these recordings were still playing, echoing through the speakers embedded in the warehouse walls. The pleas were real. The cries for help were genuine, calling not only Marcus, but also the names of the previous guards, because the system was programmed to detect movement and randomly play these recordings. A psychological safety mechanism, perhaps, or just a macabre accident of time. The impact of this revelation was devastating. Marcus was literally hearing the last cries for help from children who had died 40 years ago. He sat on the cold basement floor surrounded by evidence of one of the darkest stories Detroit had tried to forget, and made the most important decision of his life. He would no longer be one to keep this secret. He would no longer be one to allow these children to remain forgotten. The journey that began with fear and confusion now had a crystal-clear purpose. Marcus was going to expose everything. Every document, every recording, every name, no matter who tried to stop him, no matter the consequences. Some truths are too big to remain buried. What Marcus felt at that moment is something I want you to reflect on. Comment here. Justice delayed is better than no justice, and now you're going to discover exactly how he transformed that discovery into real action. Marcus climbed those concrete stairs with a weight on his shoulders that hadn't been there when he came down. But it was a different kind of weight. It wasn't the weight of fear or uncertainty. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of carrying truths that other people had tried to bury for decades. He knew exactly what he needed to do. The transformation within him was complete. He was no longer just a security guard doing his shift. He was the only living witness to what that place truly represented. And he wouldn't simply lock that door and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Some decisions in life are bigger than ourselves. Some truths demand courage that goes beyond our personal comfort. and Marcus was about to prove that there are still people willing to do the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when it's frightening, even when it might cost everything. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. First thing, document absolutely everything. Marcus started taking photos, the files one by one, the photos of the children, the signed documents, the payment records, the incriminating correspondence, every piece of evidence that could be captured digitally. Then, videos. He recorded the entire lab, narrating what he was seeing, describing every detail so that it would be recorded not only visually, but also with context. The rusty medical equipment, the stained surgical tables, the old recording system still connected, everything. And then the most important part, he retrieved physical documents. He carefully selected the most incriminating files, those containing signatures of important people, those that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt what had happened there. He stored everything in a backpack he found in the lab itself. Removing evidence was risky, he knew, but he also knew that if he left everything there and simply reported it, there was a real chance that someone would come before the authorities and make it all disappear. Again. When the sun finally rose over Detroit that morning, Marcus didn't go home. He didn't sleep. He didn't rest. He went straight to the newsroom of the Detroit Free Press, the city's largest newspaper. He arrived at 7 in the morning, still in his security guard uniform, his backpack full of historical documents and his cell phone loaded with digital evidence. The receptionist looked at him suspiciously. A visibly shaken man, with deep dark circles under his eyes, talking about illegal medical experiments from 40 years ago, wasn't exactly the kind of source that inspires immediate credibility. At first, no one believed him. The first journalist who attended to him listened to his story politely, but with obvious skepticism. Conspiracy theories, urban legends, every veteran reporter has heard hundreds of crazy stories from well-meaning but confused people. But then Marcus opened his backpack. He showed the documents, he showed the photos, he showed the videos, and the journalist's mindset changed completely. The children's names were real. A simple cross-check confirmed these were real people who had disappeared or died under questionable circumstances during the 1980s. The signatures on the documents were verifiable. Some of the listed doctors were still alive, retired in other states. The political connections could be traced. This wasn't fantasy. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was documented history being revealed for the first time. The entire newsroom was mobilized. Investigative reporters, senior editors, even the newspaper's director was called in. And the decision was unanimous. This story needed to be told. But first, it needed to be verified. The newspaper contacted the authorities. Forensic investigators, accompanied by reporters, were sent to the Porter & Sons warehouse that same afternoon. Marcus personally led them to the hidden door in Sector D. They descended those stairs together, and when they saw the laboratory with their own eyes, when they touched those documents, when they heard those old recordings reproducing the voices of children who had died decades ago, the magnitude of what was being discovered became undeniable. The story exploded, not just locally but nationally. Detroit was forced to reopen one of the darkest cases in its history. The impact was immediate and devastating. Families who had lost children 40 years ago and never knew exactly what happened finally had answers. Some of these families still had living members, now elderly, who had spent decades wondering if they could have done something differently, if they should have been more suspicious, if they should have rejected those financial agreements. The revelation brought both relief and renewed pain, because they finally knew the truth. But the truth was horrific. The revelations continued for weeks. Each document led to another. Each name revealed new connections. The web of complicity was much larger than Marcus initially imagined, and he, the night watchman who just wanted to do his job in peace, had become the catalyst for one of the biggest historical investigations in Detroit in decades. In March of 2024, 5 months after that night that changed everything, the Porter & Sons warehouse was officially sealed off, not as a simple abandoned building, but as a historic crime scene. Yellow police tape surrounded the entire perimeter. Signs were installed identifying the site as part of an ongoing investigation. And something more important, a temporary memorial began to appear outside. Flowers, candles, photos of children who never had the chance to grow old. Handwritten messages from families who could finally publicly honor the memory of their children, siblings, cousins, because now they knew. Now the truth was no longer buried. The impact of this transformation was profound, not only for the families directly affected, but for the entire city of Detroit. It was a reckoning with the past, a recognition that some wounds need to be opened so that they can finally heal properly. The families of the 23 children, or what remained of them, were located one by one through the meticulous work of investigators and genealogists. Many of the parents had already passed away, taking with them decades of silent grief and unanswered questions. But there were siblings, now elderly in their 60s and 70s. There were cousins. There were uncles and aunts who remembered those children. And for each of them, the revelation brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief at finally knowing what happened, anger at having been deceived for so long, renewed sadness at confronting details they would rather not know. But above all, gratitude. Gratitude that someone had the courage not to let those stories remain forgotten. The state of Michigan, pressured by public opinion and the national media, established a compensation fund. It wasn't about money. It never would be. No amount could bring back those lives or those stolen years. But it was a public acknowledgement, an official apology, an admission that the system failed catastrophically with those children and their families. Marcus was summoned to testify at multiple hearings, state committees, federal investigations into historical medical practices. Even a special commission on research ethics was formed, using the Porter and Sons case as a central example of what should never have happened. He sat in those witness chairs under spotlights with cameras pointed at him and told his story repeatedly. The night, the voices, the discovery, every detail was important to the unfolding legal process. And slowly, Marcus transformed into something he never sought to be. A symbol of civic courage, of doing the right thing even when it's difficult, of not accepting the status quo when it's fundamentally wrong. Newspapers wrote editorials about him. News programs invited him for interviews. Schools asked him to speak to students about social responsibility and integrity. But in all these appearances, in all these conversations, Marcus always said the same thing. It wasn't courage. He explained that courage implies doing something extraordinary, something heroic, something beyond what any normal person would do. But for Marcus, what he did was simply the basics. It was simply listening. Those voices had wanted to be heard for 40 years, he said. They were there, reproducing on hidden loudspeakers, calling vigilante after vigilante, hoping someone would pay attention, hoping someone would not just hear, but truly listen. And the difference between those two things is enormous. Listening is passive. It's sound entering your ears without really processing the meaning. Listening is active. It's choosing to pay attention. It's deciding that it matters. And Marcus listened. He didn't ignore it. He didn't rationalize it away. He didn't decide it was someone else's problem. He listened and acted. That was the mindset that made all the difference. The conscious decision that if something is wrong and you have the power to do something about it, then you have the responsibility to act. The revelations continued to unfold even months later. Historical researchers began investigating whether similar cases had occurred in other cities. Some troubling connections were found. The pharmaceutical company that operated Porter and Sons had subsidiaries in 6 other states. And, although nothing as well documented as the Detroit lab was discovered, there were suspicious patterns. Missing children, orphanages that closed abruptly, silent financial deals. The journey Marcus began that October night was revealing layers he never imagined existed. And that makes you think, doesn't it, about how many other stories are still hidden, how many other places hold secrets that need to see the light of day, how many voices are still waiting for someone willing to truly listen. Marcus didn't change the whole world. He didn't solve all the problems, but he changed something. for those families, for that city, for those who heard his story and felt inspired not to ignore the voices they find on their own journeys. If Marcus's story touched you in any way, comment here, "I will listen too." And now, let me tell you what Marcus is doing today and what message he wants to leave for you. Marcus Williams continues to live in Detroit. He hasn't returned to working as a night watchman, not because he's afraid, but because his life has taken a completely different turn. Today he works with victims' rights organizations, helping families seeking answers about old, unsolved cases. He has become a voice for those who cannot be heard. And when you talk to him, when you hear his story directly from the source, one thing becomes absolutely clear. Marcus doesn't see himself as a hero. He sees himself as someone who simply did what any decent person should do. And perhaps that's exactly what makes his story so powerful. Because he had no superpowers. He had no special training to handle historical discoveries. He had no political connections or influence. He was just an ordinary man who refused to be another link in the chain of silence. And if he managed to do that, what does that say about what each of us is capable of when we decide to truly listen? Marcus's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many voices around us are waiting to be heard right now? I'm not just talking about historical mysteries or buried crimes, although those certainly exist. I'm talking about the voices in our own lives. That co-worker who is clearly suffering, but no one asks how they really are. That injustice in your community that everyone sees but no one wants to get involved in because it's complicated. That inconvenient truth that's easier to ignore than to confront. The mindset Marcus demonstrated isn't about being brave in the traditional sense. It's about having the integrity to not conform to what's wrong just because it's more comfortable. It's about making decisions based on what's right, not what's easy. And that's something we all face, on different scales, almost every day. Think of the transformation that happened because of a single decision. One person chose to investigate instead of ignoring. One person chose to document instead of forgetting. One person chose to speak instead of remaining silent. And 23 children who had been forgotten for 40 years finally had their names acknowledged. Families who carried pain and guilt for decades finally received answers. An entire city was forced to confront a dark chapter of its history. Policies were changed. Oversight systems were strengthened. All because Marcus Williams heard voices in the darkness and decided they mattered. The impact of this journey spread far beyond what he could have foreseen that October night. And it continues to spread. Because every person who hears this story is invited to make the same choice. When you find your own voices, what will you do? How many truths are hidden at this very moment because someone, somewhere decided it was more convenient to forget? Because some company, some institution, some powerful person decided that keeping secrets was better than facing consequences. The backstage of our society, our communities, our own lives, is full of things we know are wrong but choose not to see. And every time we make that choice, we become part of the problem. Not because we are bad people, but because we decide that our personal convenience is worth more than the truth. Marcus shows us that there is another way, a more difficult way certainly, a way that demands more of us, but a way that allows us to look in the mirror and know that when it mattered, when it really mattered, we made the right choice. The message Marcus wants to leave you with, and which I want to reinforce here, is simple but profound. Courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about acting despite it. It's about recognizing that you're scared, that you're insecure, that it would be much easier to simply move on, but choosing to do what's right anyway. Because in the end, it's not the grand gestures that change the world. It's the small decisions of ordinary people who refuse to accept the unacceptable. It's the moments when someone stops, truly listens, and decides that what they're hearing deserves action. Marcus wasn't special before that night, but he became special through his choices, and you have the same potential, we all do. The question is, when your time comes, when you hear your own voice calling in the darkness, what will you do? Will you ignore it and move on? Or will you stop, listen, and have the courage to do something about it? The truth always finds a way to be heard. Sometimes it waits decades. Sometimes it needs to pass through many people before finding the one who is willing to truly stop and pay attention. Marcus Williams was just a night watchman doing his job, but he became the right person at the right time with the right mindset. And that changed everything, not only for him, but for dozens of families, for an entire city, and who knows, maybe for you watching now. If you've made it this far to this final moment of the video, it's because this story touched something within you. And that means something. It means you're also the kind of person who doesn't ignore what matters, who values the truth even when it's difficult, who understands that some stories need to be told, no matter how much time has passed. So if you identified with this message, if Marcus's journey made sense to you, leave a like below, not as an empty gesture, but as a way of saying that you also believe that voices need to be heard and that truths deserve to be revealed. And comment there, "This message was for me." Because when you do that, you're not just interacting with the video. You're committing to that idea. You're saying that when your time comes, when you find your own voices waiting to be heard, you'll remember this story and you'll have the courage to make the right choice. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, now's the time. Because I bring you stories like this every week. Real stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply by refusing to accept what's wrong. Stories that make us think, that challenge us, that remind us of what really matters. Hit that subscribe button and activate the bell because you won't want to miss what's coming next. And look, there's a video over here that perfectly complements what we talked about today. It's about other people who also had to make difficult choices between what's comfortable and what's right. Click there and continue with me. Let's embark on this journey together to discover stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for staying until the end. Seriously, that shows the kind of person you are. And the world needs more people like you.